The Duke of Whitmore walked into his own winter ball with another woman on his arm, and every soul in that grand hall knew it wasn't his wife. His 14-year-old son stood frozen on the staircase watching his father smile at a stranger the way he had never smiled at his mother. Margaret Ashcombe didn't weep. She didn't shatter a glass or raise her voice. She asked her husband one quiet question, and the answer told her everything she needed to know. By morning she was packing. Not her gowns, not her jewels. She packed the ledgers. If you've ever watched someone you love choose the wrong path and refuse every hand offered to pull them back, stay with us. Subscribe to this channel and tell us in the comments. Where are you listening from tonight? The winter ball at Whitmore Abbey was the most anticipated evening of the season in all of Devonshire. Every year, when December settled over the countryside and frost crept along the stone walls of the estate, the Duke of Whitmore opened his doors to the finest families in England. The fires burned high in every hearth. The silver gleamed on tables long enough to seat 60. The musicians tuned their instruments in the East Gallery, and the scent of pine boughs and beeswax candles drifted through corridors that had stood for 300 years. It was by every measure the kind of evening that reminded people why the Ashcombe name still meant something. Margaret had spent 3 weeks preparing for it. She had reviewed the guest list twice, corresponded personally with 4 families whose tenancy arrangements needed delicate handling before they arrived, arranged the seating with the precision of someone who understood that where a man sat at table could mean the difference between a profitable partnership and a 3-year grudge. She had ordered the kitchens to prepare the venison pies that Lord Hartwell favored, because Lord Hartwell controlled the northern water rights that Sebastian had been quietly negotiating for 8 months. She had made certain that the Pemberton widow was seated near the Alderton sisters, because Lady Pemberton had been isolated since her husband's death, and Margaret had noticed in the way she always noticed that the woman's hands shook slightly when she stood alone in a room. Margaret noticed things. It was perhaps the quality that had made her most indispensable to Whitmore Abbey, and the quality that Sebastian had long since stopped appreciating. She stood at the top of the main staircase at 7:30, dressed in dark green silk, her hair pinned with the emerald clips that had belonged to Sebastian's grandmother. She wore them because Sebastian's mother had given them to her on the morning of their wedding, with the words, "These are for a woman who understands what this family requires of her." 14 years later, Margaret understood it better than anyone. Thomas stood beside her. At 14, Lord Thomas Ashcombe was already tall for his age, with his father's dark eyes and his mother's careful way of observing a room before speaking in it. He had his father's jaw strong, slightly set, but he had inherited his mother's habit of reading people's faces, the way other boys read adventure novels, with complete absorption and total retention. "Is father coming down soon?" Margaret smoothed the front of her gown with one hand. "He'll be here when he's ready." Thomas watched the guests beginning to arrive below the rustle of evening cloaks, the murmur of polite greetings, footmen moving efficiently between clusters of people. "He's been in his study since 4 o'clock. "I know." Thomas looked at her. He had learned not to press his mother when her voice took on that particular quality, steady in a way that was different from ordinary steadiness. The way a riverbank is steady when the water is moving very fast just beneath the surface. The first carriage guests had filled half the ballroom when the front doors opened again. Thomas saw his father first. Sebastian Ashcombe, the 6th Duke of Whitmore, was a man who commanded attention without effort. All broad-shouldered, with the kind of physical presence that filled a doorframe and made lesser men straighten their spines without realizing they were doing it. He was dressed impeccably as always. But he was not alone. The woman on his arm was perhaps 30 years old, with copper-colored hair arranged in the fashionable French style, and a gown of deep ivory that had not been purchased in any shop in Devonshire. She moved the way certain women move when they have learned that being looked at is a form of power. Slowly, with a slight smile already in place, as though she had arrived at a party given in her honor. Thomas felt his stomach drop before he fully understood why. He had never seen this woman before. He was certain of that. He was equally certain, with the instinct of a boy who had been quietly watching adults his entire life, that she was not a distant cousin or a family friend, or any of the other explanations that might have made sense. The way his father's hand rested at her back made no sense. Not that way. Below the room shifted. It was subtle, the kind of shift that happens when people notice something they are not yet prepared to speak of aloud. Conversations continued. Glasses were lifted. But eyes moved, and then quickly moved away again, and then moved back. Lord and Lady Hartwell stood near the fireplace. Lady Hartwell's fan, which had been moving in its steady, practiced rhythm, stopped. Margaret had not moved. Thomas looked at her. Her face was composed. Entirely perfectly composed. And that was the thing that frightened him more than anything else he had seen in the past 30 seconds, because he had seen his mother grieve, and he had seen her angry, and he had seen her exhausted, and he knew the difference between her face when she was feeling nothing, and her face when she was feeling everything, and allowing none of it to move. This was the second thing. Sebastian looked up. For one moment his gaze found his wife at the top of the staircase. He did not look away from her. He did not look guilty. He looked, Thomas would think later, almost impatient, the way a man looks when he expects a complication and is already calculating how quickly it can be resolved. Sebastian guided his companion forward into the room and greeted Lord Hartwell with the easy confidence of a man who believed that his position protected him from the consequences of his choices. Thomas waited for his father to come to the staircase, to come to his mother. Sebastian did not come. Margaret descended the staircase, not quickly, not slowly. At exactly the pace appropriate for a duchess entering her own hall, with her shoulders back, and the emerald clips catching the candlelight, and her expression giving nothing away to the people watching her, and they were all watching her now. Every person in the room from beneath lowered lashes and over the rims of champagne glasses and through the reflections in the tall windows. Thomas followed 2 steps behind. Sebastian turned when he heard them approach. Margaret. A slight nod as though she were a neighbor who had dropped by unexpectedly. You look well. Thank you. Her voice was even. I wasn't aware we had an additional guest this evening. Celestine Beaumont. Sebastian said it with the tone of a man announcing something that ought to explain itself. She's been in Bath for the season and found herself without plans for the evening. I invited her. I see. Celestine Beaumont offered a smile that was warm enough to be friendly and measured enough to be cautious. Your Grace, what a magnificent home. I've heard so much about Whitmore Abbey, but the descriptions hardly do it justice. Margaret looked at her directly. Miss Beaumont. A pause. I hope you'll enjoy the evening. It was neither cold nor warm. It was the response of a woman who has made an instantaneous calculation and decided that this particular moment in this particular room with these particular witnesses is not the moment for the conversation that actually needs to happen. Thomas watched his father. Sebastian had relaxed. He had expected resistance. Thomas could see it in the way the tension left his shoulders, and the absence of it seemed to confirm something he already believed, that Margaret would absorb this the way she absorbed everything else, quietly and without making it difficult for him. Lord Hartwell materialized at Sebastian's elbow with the practiced timing of a man who has spent 50 years attending important parties and understands when someone needs rescuing from a potentially awkward social moment. Ashcombe, wonderful evening. I wanted to speak with you about the northern boundary question. My solicitor had some thoughts. Sebastian turned to him readily. Thomas stayed near his mother. The ball continued. It continued the way formal events continue, even when something has gone terribly wrong with music and food and conversation, and the trained social grace of people who understand that falling apart in public is the one unforgivable act. Margaret spoke with Lady Hartwell for 20 minutes about the village school. She complimented Lady Alderton on her daughter's engagement. She arranged with a few quiet words to the head footman for the fire in the east sitting room to be stoked, because she had noticed that Sir Edward Fenwick had been coughing, and the draughts in the east gallery were always worse than people expected. She did everything she had always done. Thomas stayed close to her without quite knowing why, except that he felt with a certainty he could not have articulated that something was ending tonight, and he did not want to be on the wrong side of the room when it did. It was near 11 o'clock when Sebastian found them. Celestine Beaumont had been claimed by a small group near the piano she apparently sang, which had delighted several of the younger guests, and Sebastian crossed to where Margaret stood with a glass of wine she had barely touched. I hope you're not going to make an issue of this." His voice was low, not angry, carrying the particular tone of a man who has decided that reasonableness is being offered as a concession. Margaret looked at him. "An issue of what, Sebastian? Celestine is an old friend. Her presence here is a social courtesy. Nothing that requires this." "This? The face you're making." Margaret set down her glass. "And what face is that?" "You know what I mean." Thomas had positioned himself near the window, close enough to hear, far enough to pretend he wasn't listening. "I don't think I do." Margaret's voice was still quiet, still even. "Tell me. The face that says I've done something wrong when I've done nothing that other men in my position don't do regularly." "Other men in your position?" "A man with my responsibilities, my relationships. Certain friendships are necessary, Margaret. Necessary for the estate. For the connections that keep this family." "For the estate." Margaret repeated it. Not a question, not an accusation. Something more precise than either. "Or for your pride, Sebastian." Sebastian's jaw tightened. "That's unworthy of you." "Is it?" "I've always been honest with you about—" "Have you been honest with Lord Hartwell?" She said it without heat. "He's been negotiating the water rights in good faith for 8 months. He brought his wife tonight because this is an occasion that matters to him. He looked at you when you walked in with that woman, and I watched him make a calculation about whether the partnership is still worth his trouble." Sebastian blinked. "Hartwell isn't—" "He's a proud man, Sebastian. He has 3 daughters and a wife who has never put a foot wrong in 40 years of marriage. He does business with men whose households reflect their character." She picked up her glass again. "You know this. I've told you this." "You're being dramatic." "I'm being accurate." A pause. "There's a difference. You used to know that." Sebastian looked at her for a long moment. "Your mother taught you how to worry unnecessarily. My mother taught me how to read a room." "You think you're indispensable." His voice had changed, something harder beneath it now, something that had been building for longer than tonight. "You think that because you manage the correspondence, and sit with the tenants, and remember everyone's birthdays, you are what? The actual Duke of Whitmore." Margaret did not answer immediately. When she did, her voice was so quiet that Thomas had to hold himself very still to hear it. "I think that you are a brilliant man who has begun to confuse the people who serve you with the furniture." Sebastian's face went flat. "Good night, Margaret." He walked away. Margaret stood at the window for a moment, looking out at the frost-covered gardens below. Thomas came to stand beside her. Neither of them spoke. After a moment, Margaret touched the back of his hand once briefly, and then she straightened, and her face rearranged itself into the expression appropriate for a duchess who still had guests to tend to, and she moved back into the room. Thomas watched her go. He watched his father laughing near the piano where Celestine Beaumont had begun to sing something light and French and entirely charming. He watched the way Lord Hartwell's wife did not look at the piano. He watched the way the old housekeeper, Mrs. Pemberton, no relation to the widow, stood near the kitchen corridor, with an expression Thomas had never seen on her face before. Not disapproval exactly, but something older and sadder than disapproval. The expression of a woman who has served a house long enough to know when something is breaking. Thomas was 14 years old, and he understood somewhere below the level of conscious thought that the world had just shifted on its axis. He did not know yet what his mother would decide. He only knew that she would decide something. The house fell quiet after 2 in the morning. Guests had departed. Servants moved through the rooms collecting glasses and straightening furniture. The fires were being banked. Thomas lay in his bed and did not sleep. At 2:30 he heard footsteps in the corridor. Not his father's heavy, decisive tread, but his mother's lighter step, moving with a purpose that was different from her usual nighttime pattern. He got up. The door to his mother's sitting room. The small room adjacent to her bedchamber, where she kept her correspondence and her account books, was open, and light came from within. He stood in the doorway. Margaret was at her writing desk, but she was not writing. She was stacking ledgers. Not her personal correspondence. Not the household accounts in the narrow sense. The ledgers that governed Whitmore Abbey. The tenancy rolls, the crop rotation schedules, the records of loans made to struggling families in bad seasons, the agreements that had been struck by handshake over the past 14 years and then documented in her careful, precise hand, because she had learned early that a handshake could be forgotten, but a written record could not. The records of every family on the estate, every arrangement, every promise. She was stacking them and then packing them into a leather case she used for traveling documents. "Mama." Margaret looked up. She had not been startled she had heard him in the corridor. "You should be asleep." "What are you doing?" She looked down at the ledger in her hands. Then she set it carefully in the case. "Organizing." "Those are Father's estate books. They are the estate books." A pause. "I wrote most of them." Thomas came into the room. He looked at the case. He looked at his mother's face. "Are you leaving?" Margaret was quiet for a moment. "I am not going anywhere tonight." "But—" She looked at him directly. "Thomas." Her voice was careful and honest, the way it always was with him. She had never believed in softening reality into shapes that were easier to swallow. She believed in giving him the truth in doses he could bear. "Your father made a choice tonight. It was not the first choice of this kind, but it was a particular kind of choice made in front of people who matter in a way that said something about what he believes and what he expects. He expects you to accept it." "Yes." "Are you going to—" Margaret closed the leather case. "I have accepted a great many things." She folded her hands on top of the case. "I have accepted being excluded from conversations I should have been part of. I have accepted watching decisions get made without my knowledge that affected people who relied on me. I have accepted a great deal, Thomas, because I believed that what I was doing, the work I was doing, the relationships I was maintaining, mattered enough to stay for." Thomas sat down in the chair across from her desk. "And now—" She looked at him for a long moment. "Now I'm not certain that staying makes any of it matter more." The candle between them guttered in a draft from the window, and for a moment shadows moved across her face and Thomas saw something he had never quite seen before. Not his mother in her role of duchess. Not his mother managing a household or navigating a social crisis, but the woman underneath all of it. The woman who had been doing all of it alone for longer than he had understood. "I'm frightened," he said. He said it without shame, the way she had always let him say difficult things. "I know." She reached across the desk and put her hand over his. "So am I." "Of what?" "Of staying in a place where what I do has stopped mattering to the person it should matter to most." Thomas looked at the ledgers. "He'll notice," he said, "when they're gone." "Yes." She withdrew her hand. "He will." "Is that why you're taking them?" Margaret considered this. "I'm taking them because they represent 14 years of work. Work that belongs to this estate and to every family on it." She rose and carried the case to the small cabinet by the window where she kept documents that needed safekeeping. "I am taking them because if something is going to happen to Whitmore Abbey, if something is going to go wrong, I want to know that the records exist somewhere safe and that the people who depend on this land have some protection." Thomas was quiet. "Then, you've already decided." Margaret did not answer that directly. She locked the cabinet, and she put the key in her pocket, and she turned to face her son. "Go to bed, Thomas." "Mama, I love you." She said it simply. "And I need you to trust that whatever happens, I am thinking of you. I am always thinking of you." A pause. "But I cannot make this decision based on what is easy. Do you understand that?" He did understand it. He had always understood at some deep level that his mother made decisions the way good engineers build bridges. Not for the moment, but for the years ahead. Not for what looks stable, but for what will actually hold. He went back to his room. He lay in the dark and listened to the house settle around him, the old stones contracting in the cold, the sound of the night wind coming off the moors. He thought about the ledgers in the cabinet. He thought about his father's face when he had said, "You think you're indispensable." He thought about the way Celestine Beaumont had smiled. And he thought about his mother's hands, steady, always steady. Placing those books in that case, with the care of someone who is not packing in panic, but packing in clarity, The way you pack when you have finally made a decision you know you will not unmake. In the morning, Thomas came downstairs to find his father at breakfast, reading correspondence with the settled air of a man who has filed away an unpleasant evening and moved on. Sebastian looked up. "Did you sleep?" "Not well. Winter air always disrupts sleep." Sebastian returned to his correspondence. "We'll go riding this afternoon if the frost has lifted." Thomas sat down. He poured his own tea. He did not say Mother packed the ledgers last night. He did not say she wasn't packing her gowns. He did not say, "I think you should be afraid, Father, and I think you have no idea why." He sat at the breakfast table of Whitmore Abbey and drank his tea and understood with a quiet certainty that would stay with him for the rest of his life that his father was about to discover the difference between the things a man owns and the things that make him who he is. The frost had lifted by noon. They did not go riding. Margaret spent the morning in correspondence. Sebastian spent the morning receiving his new estate manager, a young man named Clifford, who had come recommended by a business associate in London, and who approached the position with the crisp confidence of someone trained in numbers and systems, and entirely innocent of the human geography of a place like Whitmore. Thomas watched from the upper corridor as his father showed Clifford through the estate offices. He watched his father explain things he half understood, using language borrowed from Margaret's frameworks without crediting the source. He watched Clifford take notes. And he thought, there is so much that isn't written in those notes. There is so much that isn't in any document except the ones in the cabinet upstairs. The afternoon post brought a letter from Lord Hartwell. Margaret opened it. She read it twice. Then she set it on the hall table in the place where Sebastian always sorted his correspondence, and she went back to her sitting room. Thomas picked it up. He read it. Hartwell was withdrawing from the water rights negotiation. The letter was cordial, brief, and entirely final. Thomas put the letter back on the table. He thought about what his mother had said the night before about Hartwell being a proud man. He thought about the way she had said it, not as a prediction, not as a threat, but as a plain statement of fact, the kind of fact that only becomes visible to other people after the damage has already been done. He went upstairs. He knocked on his mother's sitting room door. "Come in." She was at her desk. She was writing a letter of her own. Hartwell withdrew, Thomas said. "I know." "Did you know last night?" Margaret looked up. "I knew it was possible." "Father doesn't know yet." "No." Thomas stood in the doorway. "Mama, is there anything I can do?" She looked at him for a long moment, and the look was not the look of a mother managing a child, but something older and more equal than that, the look of one person taking the full measure of another. "Be the man your father could have been," she said. "When it is your turn." Thomas felt the words land in him the way certain words do not, as comfort, not as instruction, but as something that will live quietly in the chest for decades and only be fully understood much later. He nodded once and went back to his room. And in the study downstairs, the letter from Lord Hartwell waited on the table. And in the cabinet in the Duchess's sitting room, 14 years of carefully kept records waited in the dark. And in the cold, December afternoon of Whitmore Abbey, something that had been quietly built over a long time was quietly, irrevocably beginning to come apart. The letter from Lord Hartwell sat on the hall table for 6 hours before Sebastian found it. Thomas watched from the landing, not hiding exactly, but not announcing himself either, as his father picked up the envelope, broke the seal, and read. Sebastian's face did not change dramatically. It rarely did. He was a man who had trained himself to receive information without displaying his reaction to it, a skill that had served him well in boardrooms and across negotiating tables for 15 years. But his hand tightened on the paper. Just slightly. Just enough. He read it a second time, and then he folded it with the precise, deliberate care of a man who is deciding what to do with something that has surprised him more than he intended to let it surprise him. Then he walked to Margaret's sitting room and knocked. She opened the door herself. She had sent her lady's maid away an hour ago. "Hartwell is withdrawing." Sebastian held up the letter. "Did you know about this?" "I suspected it was possible." "You suspected?" His voice carried something careful in it, not quite an accusation, not quite a question. "And you didn't think to tell me? I told you last night." Margaret stepped back from the doorway, but did not invite him in a distinction so small that most people would have missed it, but Sebastian felt it. "I told you about Hartwell. I told you what kind of man he is. You told me I was being dramatic, your words. No. I told you he was a proud man who watches how other men conduct their households." She moved to her desk. "You told me I was being dramatic." Sebastian looked at the letter in his hand. For a moment, just a moment, something flickered behind his eyes. Something that might, in a different man, have been the beginning of an admission. Then it was gone. "I'll write to Hartwell directly, man to man. This can be repaired." "It can," Margaret agreed, "though it will take considerably more than a letter." "I've been managing relationships in this county for 15 years, Margaret. You've been managing them with my assistants for 15 years. There's a difference." She said it without heat, without triumph. "Hartwell's wife is the one who matters. She's been Lady Hartwell for 42 years, and she has never once in all that time been publicly embarrassed by her husband. That is the standard she holds everyone to." Sebastian was quiet. "Write to him if you like," Margaret added. "But the letter that will actually matter is the one his wife is writing to her cousin right now. Lady Hartwell's cousin is married to the Earl of Sefton, who sits on the board of the Manchester Textile Exchange, the one you've been trying to access for 2 years. Sebastian stared at her. He had not known about the cousin. He was certain of that, and the certainty had a specific quality, the particular sharpness of realizing that there is a room in your own house you have never noticed before. He left without answering. Margaret sat down at her desk and continued writing her letter. Thomas had heard all of it. He retreated to his room before his father reached the landing, and he sat on the edge of his bed and turned the conversation over in his mind, the way he turned over difficult problems in mathematics, looking for the shape of it, the underlying logic. His mother had not told his father about Lady Hartwell's cousin in order to help him repair the situation. She had told him so that he would understand precisely and completely the dimensions of what he had damaged. There was a difference. Thomas was beginning to understand that with his mother, there was almost always a difference between what she said and what she meant, between what she offered and what she withheld, between what looked like gentleness and what was actually something much more deliberate. He was 14 years old, and he was receiving an education that had nothing to do with his tutors. The week that followed was the quietest and most dangerous week Thomas had ever lived through in Whitmore Abbey. Quiet because the surface of things continued undisturbed, meals were served. Correspondence was handled. The estate's daily rhythms moved forward with the reliable momentum of a machine that has been well built and knows no other speed. Dangerous because Thomas could feel in the way children always feel, the tremors beneath adult composure, that everything was accelerating toward something. Sebastian threw himself into the estate with the focused energy of a man who is trying to prove something. He met with Clifford, his new estate manager, every morning. He reviewed accounts. He dictated letters. He moved through the business of Whitmore with a briskness that looked from the outside like confidence. Thomas went with him twice. He watched Clifford take notes. He watched his father explain the rotation schedules for the northern fields using language. He had heard his mother use the same language, the same frameworks delivered now as though they had originated with Sebastian himself. Clifford wrote everything down. What Clifford did not write down, what no one had thought to put in any document, was that old Barrows, who worked the northern fields and had done so for 31 years, had a bad knee that flared in wet weather and needed accommodating when the winter work schedules were set. Or that the Hartley family in the third cottage had a standing arrangement with Margaret to pay their autumn rent in wool rather than coin, because they ran a small flock, and the wool was worth more than the cash they rarely had liquid. Or that Mr. Fenwick, the head groomsman, would follow any instruction without complaint, but would begin to lose faith in a person the moment he sensed that person was uncertain, and that the way to maintain Fenwick's loyalty was never to issue an order you were not prepared to back. These things existed nowhere in writing. They existed in Margaret's memory, and in the network of quiet, ongoing relationships she had been maintaining for 14 years. On the 9th day after the ball, One of those relationships made itself visible in a way Sebastian could not ignore. A delegation of 4 tenant farmers came to the house. They did not have an appointment. They asked to see the Duke. Sebastian received them in the estate office. He was courteous. He was attentive. He listened to what they had to say. What they said was this: the announcement that their winter rent relief, a grace period that had been granted every year for the past decade, to families who had suffered poor harvests, would not be offered this season, had reached them through Clifford, and they had come to confirm whether this was correct. Sebastian had not known about the winter rent relief. He had not seen it in the accounts. It had never been entered as a formal policy, because it had never been a formal policy. It had been a practice established quietly by Margaret, handled through direct conversation with each affected family, recorded only in her private ledgers. The same ledgers that were now locked in the cabinet in her sitting room. Sebastian told the delegation that he would look into it and give them an answer within the week. After they left, he sat in the estate office for a long time. Thomas heard about the meeting from Mrs. Finch, the housekeeper, a broad, plain-spoken woman who had been at Whitmore Abbey for 20 years and who made no secret of her loyalties, though she was too professional to state them aloud. She did not state them aloud now. She simply mentioned to Thomas while he was passing through the kitchen corridor that the 4 farmers had waited 3 hours before being seen, and that when they left their faces had the expression of men who were not yet worried but were beginning to calculate whether they should be. Thomas went to find his mother. She was in the small garden, not because she was hiding, but because she walked in it every afternoon when the weather permitted, and she saw no reason to change that today. Thomas fell into step beside her. The farmers came today. I heard. Father didn't know about the winter relief arrangement. No, Margaret agreed. He wouldn't. It was never in the formal accounts. Will he figure it out? He'll figure out that the arrangement existed. Whether he'll understand why it existed. She paused. That's a different question. Thomas walked beside her for a moment. Why did you never put it in the formal accounts? Margaret considered this carefully, the way she always considered things before she answered him. When I began doing it, I put it to your father as a proposal. He said it was sentimental. He said the estate couldn't be managed on the basis of sympathy. She reached out and touched the bare branch of a rosebush with her gloved fingers. So I managed it separately, through informal arrangements and private records, because the families needed it and the estate could afford it, and someone had to take responsibility for the fact that people who depend on us are not simply line items in an account book. He said it was sentimental. Yes. Thomas thought about this. About a younger version of his father, the version who used to ask his mother what she thought. The version before the success had calcified into certainty. When did he change? Thomas asked. Father, when did he stop listening to you? Margaret was quiet for long enough that Thomas thought she might not answer. Gradually, she finally said. And then all at once. The way most things go wrong. She stopped walking. She looked at the house, at the stone walls, and the winter bare gardens, and the windows of Whitmore Abbey, catching the late afternoon light. Your father is a brilliant man, she said. I want you to understand that. He took an estate that was in debt when he inherited it, and turned it into something genuinely prosperous. He has real ability, real intelligence. A pause. But somewhere in the years of success, he began to believe that the success was only his. That the decisions were only his, that the results would be the same regardless of who else was working beside him. He forgot you were there. He decided I wasn't necessary. She turned from the house. That's different. Forgetting someone could be an accident. Deciding they're unnecessary is a choice. The cold had teeth in it by the time they went inside. At dinner that evening, Sebastian announced that he had reviewed the estate accounts and was implementing a new management approach effective in the new year. Clifford would take full oversight of tenant relations. The informal arrangements that had apparently accumulated over the years would be formalized or discontinued based on their economic viability. Thomas watched his mother's face across the table. She ate. She listened. She asked at one point a quiet and precise question about what would happen to the families currently in arrears from the summer drought. whether the formalization process would include a transition period. Sebastian said that Clifford would assess each situation on its merits. Margaret nodded once, said nothing more, but Thomas saw her hand beneath the table press flat against her knee. A small contained gesture, the gesture of a woman pressing something down before it rises. After dinner, Thomas helped himself to the decanter of brandy his father kept in the library, something he had never done before, and which he did now, less because he wanted a drink, and more because he needed the library to be empty when his father came in so that he could be there already, and so that leaving would require effort. Sebastian came in at 9:30. He stopped when he saw Thomas. "You're up late. Couldn't sleep." Thomas held up the glass. "I helped myself. I hope that's all right." Sebastian studied him for a moment. Then he moved to the decanter and poured his own glass and sat in the chair by the window. His chair, the one he always chose. They sat in silence for a while. Thomas had learned from his mother that silence could be a tool that the right kind of quiet held long enough would often pull words from the person who was most uncomfortable with it. Sebastian spoke first. "The delegation today, the farmers. I heard about them." "Did your mother tell you?" "Mrs. Finch mentioned it." Sebastian turned his glass in his hands. "Your mother has been running what amounts to a shadow administration. Arrangements made without my knowledge. Relief extended without my authorization. Agreements that never appeared in any document I reviewed." Thomas looked at him. "Did the agreements work?" Sebastian frowned. "That's not the point. I'm asking whether they worked." A pause. "The estate has had stable tenant retention for 12 years. Lowest vacancy rate in the county." Sebastian's jaw tightened. "So yes, they worked." "Then maybe—" "The point," Sebastian said, and there was an edge in it now, "is that a man cannot manage something he doesn't know about. I should have been informed. She should have brought these things to me." Thomas set down his brandy glass. "I thought about what his mother had said. He told her it was sentimental. He thought about the careful way she had built something around her husband's blind spots. Not to deceive him, but to protect the people who would have suffered from them. He thought about himself at this table at 14 years old, understanding something his 43-year-old father had not yet understood. She did bring them to you, Thomas said. Once, at the beginning. You told her it was sentimental. Sebastian's face went very still. She told you that? Yes. She had no right to. She told me the truth about something that happened in this house. Thomas kept his voice steady, his mother's voice. He realized which was also his grandmother's voice, which was the voice of a particular kind of woman who had learned that steadiness was not the absence of feeling, but the discipline of it. I asked her a direct question. She answered it. Sebastian stood up. He moved to the window and stood with his back to the room, and Thomas could see the set of his shoulders, the particular tension that meant his father was engaged in the internal argument he always had before he said something he wouldn't be able to take back. Your mother has always been... Sebastian stopped. Thomas waited. She does things her own way. She always has. I respect that. But the estate requires another stop. The decisions about how this estate is run belong to me. They have always belonged to me. That isn't... His voice went flat. That isn't something I should have to defend to my 14-year-old son. Thomas looked at his father's back. No, he agreed. It isn't. He picked up his glass. He stood. He crossed the room to the door. Thomas. He stopped. What do you think of Clifford? Thomas turned. Sebastian was still facing the window. The question surprised him, not because his father was asking for an opinion, but because Thomas recognized with that precise instinct he had inherited from his mother that the question underneath the question was something else entirely. I think, Thomas said carefully, that he knows a great deal about numbers. Sebastian was quiet. Good night, Father. He went to bed, and in the morning, everything that had been moving slowly suddenly began to move faster. Margaret announced in the same quiet tone she used for every announcement that she would be traveling to her family's estate in Kent for an extended visit. She would be taking her personal correspondence, her traveling case, and Mrs. Finch's daughter, who served as her personal attendant. She said it at breakfast, directly, without drama. Sebastian looked up from his newspaper. Kent. Yes, I've been planning the visit for some time. My mother hasn't been well. You didn't mention this. I mentioned it in October. You were in London. She poured her tea. I assumed Clifford would have been told to include it in the household calendar. Clifford had not been told. The household calendar showed no such entry. Both of these facts communicated themselves to the room without being spoken aloud. Sebastian set down his newspaper. How long? I'm not certain yet. She looked at him directly. However long my mother needs me. Thomas watched his father's face. He saw the moment Sebastian decided not to make this difficult. Not because he was conceding anything. Thomas understood that, but because making it difficult would have required him to acknowledge in front of Thomas and Mrs. Finch and the two footmen who were attempting to be invisible near the sideboard that something significant was happening, and Sebastian had always preferred to decide that things were manageable until they were not. Very well, Sebastian said. He picked up his newspaper. Give my regards to your mother. Margaret nodded. She finished her tea. Thomas did not eat. He stared at his plate and tried to understand how a conversation this ordinary could mean something this irreversible. Margaret left 2 days later. She embraced Thomas in the entrance hall, both hands on his face for a moment, looking at him the way she always looked at him when she was about to say something she needed him to remember. You know who you are, she said. Don't let anyone else define that for you. Mama. I will write. She pressed her lips to his forehead. And you will write back. What do I tell father when he asks? She looked at him. Tell him the truth, that I have gone to take care of my mother. A pause. That is the truth, Thomas. He understood. What she was also doing was not a lie, but it was not the whole story, and the whole story was something that would take years to fully tell. The carriage carried her down the long drive of Whitmore Abbey. Thomas stood at the door and watched it go. He was still standing there when Sebastian appeared behind him. Neither of them spoke. The carriage turned at the gate and was gone. Sebastian stood at the entrance of his abbey in the cold December air, watching the empty drive. Thomas had expected something, some statement of confidence, some declaration that this was temporary and manageable and entirely within his control. Sebastian said nothing. He stood there for a long time, and Thomas thought he knows. On some level, underneath all the certainty and the new estate manager and the plans for formalization, and the careful, deliberate way he has been telling himself that nothing essential has changed. He knows. He knows she took the ledgers. He knows what the ledgers contain. He knows that what just drove through that gate was not only his wife. It was also everything he never learned to do without her. But knowing something Thomas was beginning to understand was not the same as being willing to face it. His father turned and went back inside. Thomas remained at the door a moment longer. He looked at the empty drive. He looked at the gate. He looked at the frost on the iron and the pale winter sky beyond it. Then he went inside too, and Whitmore Abbey, with all its 300 years of stone, and all its prosperity, and all its name, was suddenly very large and very quiet, in a way that had nothing to do with how many people were in it. In the estate office, Clifford worked on the accounts. He did not know about the Hartley wool arrangement. He did not know about Barrows and his knee. He did not know about the 4 families who had been quietly carried through the last drought on the strength of an agreement that existed only in a set of locked ledgers currently on their way to Kent. He knew the numbers. He did not know what the numbers were for, and in the weeks that followed this distinction, small, almost invisible, easy to dismiss as sentiment would begin to matter in ways that no account book had ever predicted and no new management structure could have prepared for. Because numbers can tell you what something costs. They cannot tell you what it's worth. Clifford lasted 6 weeks before the first crisis hit. It did not announce itself dramatically. It arrived the way most real disasters arrive, quietly through a door that had been left unlocked by a dozen small decisions that each seemed reasonable at the time. The Hartley family sent a letter in January. Thomas intercepted it, not deliberately, but because he was in the entrance hall when the post arrived, and the footman handed him the stack without thinking. And the Hartley name caught his eye, because he had heard his mother say it in that conversation in the garden, the one about wool arrangements and informal accounts. He read it. It was not an angry letter. That was what made it so hard to put down. It was a careful, plainly written letter from a man who was trying very hard to be reasonable about something that was frightening him, explaining that he had received a notice from the estate office that his arrangement for wool payment had been discontinued effective January 1st, that his autumn cash was not sufficient to cover the difference, and that he was asking whether there was someone at Whitmore he could speak to about a transition period. He addressed it to the Duchess, because that was who he always wrote to about these things. Thomas stood in the entrance hall with the letter in his hand for a long time. Then he went to the estate office where Clifford was reviewing quarterly projections with the focused satisfaction of a man who believes that clarity of data is the same thing as understanding. The Hartley family. Thomas set the letter on the desk. Do you know about their wool arrangement? Clifford looked at the letter without picking it up. The informal payment agreements are being phased out. It was announced in December. They can't cover the cash difference. That's an unfortunate situation. They'll need to apply for an arrears extension through the formal process. Thomas looked at him. What formal process? Clifford hesitated just slightly. The process is being developed. It's being developed. Thomas repeated it. So right now, there is no process. There will be by spring. Spring is 4 months away. Thomas picked up the letter. The Hartleys have 3 children. The youngest is 2 years old. Clifford's expression arranged itself into something that was attempting to be compassionate, but was fundamentally the expression of a man who has been given a metric system and asked to feel something. If we make exceptions for one family, my mother made the original arrangement because the Hartleys had an exceptionally bad year, and their wool was worth more to the estate than their cash would have been. Thomas kept his voice level. It wasn't charity. It was economics. Nevertheless, without documentation of that rationale. The documentation is in my mother's private ledgers. Silence. Then, Clifford said carefully, perhaps the Duchess should be consulted. Thomas left the estate office without responding. I went directly to his father's study. Sebastian was at his desk when Thomas entered. He looked up with the expression of a man who has been interrupted but is willing to hear the reason. Thomas put the Hartley letter on his desk. Sebastian read it. He said nothing for a moment. The wool arrangement, he finally said. I didn't know about this. I know you didn't. How many of these arrangements exist? I don't know. Only Mama knows. Sebastian set the letter down. He folded his hands on the desk in the precise, deliberate way he always did when he was ordering his thoughts. I'll write to her. Ask her to document the informal agreements so that Clifford can... Father. Thomas cut him off gently but clearly. She took the ledgers with her. Sebastian's hands went still. She took the ledgers. Yes, the private ones. The ones with all the informal records. The silence in the study was the kind of silence that has weight. Thomas could feel it pressing. She took them when she left, Sebastian said slowly. Not a question. Processing. She packed them the night after the ball. I saw her. Sebastian looked at him. You saw her, and you didn't tell me. Thomas held his father's gaze. You didn't ask. Sebastian stood up. He moved to the window. His back was to the room, and his shoulders were set in the way. Thomas had seen 100 times the architecture of a man who is refusing to show what he is feeling. Write to her, Thomas said. Ask her for the information. I will. Sebastian's voice was flat. I'll write today. And the Hartleys. A pause. I'll have Clifford extend a temporary arrangement while we sort out the documentation. Thomas nodded. He picked up the Hartley letter from the desk and set it where his father could not miss it. Then he left the study. He did not feel satisfaction about any of it. He felt the dull, exhausting ache of being the one person in a failing situation who could see all the moving parts and could not stop any of them. Sebastian wrote to Margaret that afternoon. He did not write the letter. Thomas might have hoped for. It was not an apology, not an admission, not the beginning of the honest conversation that the situation required. It was a formal request for documentation. Courteous, efficient, and entirely stripped of the personal. He asked her to provide a record of all informal tenant arrangements currently active on the Whitmore estate, with dates, terms, and the names of all parties involved. He wrote it as though he were writing to a contractor. Thomas knew this because Sebastian left the draft on his desk, and Thomas, passing through the study to retrieve a book he had left there, read it before he knew he was going to. He stood over the desk and read the letter, and felt something shift in his chest. A specific kind of grief for a man who was trying so hard not to need anyone that he was communicating the need for everything through the language of nothing. Margaret's reply came 8 days later. Thomas was not there when Sebastian read it, but he saw his father's face at dinner that evening, and the face told him enough. Margaret had sent the documentation he requested, all of it. Neatly organized, precisely labeled, with a note at the top of the first page that said, "Only enclosed. Please find the informal tenant records for Whitmore Abbey as requested." A full index is included on the final page. She had not included a personal word. Not one. She had answered his contractor's letter with a contractor's response. Sebastian did not speak much at dinner. The Hartley situation was resolved temporarily, but it was only the first stone in what was beginning to reveal itself as an avalanche, because the Hartley wool arrangement was not the only informal agreement that existed. There were 9 others in various forms for various families, based on various circumstances that Margaret had spent 14 years learning and navigating with the precise, patient intelligence of a woman who understood that a community was not a collection of accounts, but a collection of human beings, with histories and needs and dignities that mattered. Clifford found them one by one as the winter progressed. Each one was a small crisis. Each one required consultation, adjustment, improvisation. Each one cost time and goodwill, and in some cases coin that the formal accounting had not set aside. But the informal arrangements were not the only thing unraveling. In February, Mr. Gareth Whitson, who had been the estate's head groundskeeper for 19 years, came to the house to inform Sebastian that he was resigning his position, effective the end of the month. Whitson was 61 years old. He had worked at Whitmore Abbey since he was 42. He had in all that time never once raised a grievance, never once been late to his duties, never once given any indication that he was anything other than content. Sebastian received him in the estate office, which was already becoming a room that Thomas associated with difficult conversations. Thomas was not meant to be there. He had been in the adjacent room returning a ledger that Clifford had asked him to shelve when he heard Whitson's voice and stopped. "I appreciate the years, Your Grace, I do. But things have changed here, and I'm not the man to adapt to them." Sebastian's voice came back even and measured. "Changed in what way, Whitson? If there's something specific." "It's not specific, it's—" Whitson paused. "With respect. Your Grace, it's the feeling of the place. I've worked here long enough to know when a place is well, and it isn't well. The estate is performing. The estate is performing fine." A pause that had something almost painful in it. "But the people in it aren't." Silence. Her Grace, Whitson said carefully, had a way of she knew things, about people, about what they needed before they needed to ask. I don't say that to criticize present arrangements. I say it because when that kind of knowing leaves a place, the place feels it, and people start to wonder whether they're seen. "You are seen, Whitson." "I believe you mean that, Your Grace." The old man's voice was steady and kind. But meaning it and showing it are different things, and showing it that was always Her Grace's work. Thomas pressed his back against the wall of the adjacent room and breathed very carefully. He heard his father say nothing for a long moment. Then, "I'll provide you with an excellent reference." "Thank you, Your Grace." Whitson left. Thomas waited until he heard his father's chair push back from the desk, and then he waited another minute, and then he slipped out through the other door. He went straight to his room. He sat on the edge of his bed. He put his face in his hands. I was not crying. He was doing something more complicated than crying. He was feeling with a physical clarity, the weight of watching someone he loved make a mistake so large and so slow that no single moment of it was dramatic enough to correct, because there was never one clear place to point to and say this. This is where it went wrong. It was all of it. It was the whole long accumulation of it. 2 weeks after Whitson's resignation, the second major staff departure happened. Mrs. Finch came to Sebastian directly. Thomas heard about this one from the kitchen maid, a young girl named Polly, who had been at Whitmore for 2 years, and who looked when she delivered the news to Thomas in the corridor, as though she was carrying something fragile. "Mrs. Finch has given notice, my lord. She told the Duke this morning." Thomas went still. "When?" "This morning, my lord. She's been crying a bit in private, not in front of anyone." Mrs. Finch, who had been at Whitmore Abbey for 20 years, who had run the household with a combination of absolute authority and genuine warmth that kept the staff loyal and the house running with the seamless efficiency that guests always noticed but never thought to attribute to anyone specific, who had, Thomas knew without question, been loyal not to the title but to the woman behind it. He found his father in the study. Sebastian looked up when Thomas entered. His face had acquired over the past weeks a quality Thomas did not have a word for. Not quite haggardness. Not quite something you could put your finger on. A kind of thinning, as though some essential insulation had been removed. "You've heard about Mrs. Finch," Thomas said. "Yes." "Did she tell you why?" Sebastian set down his pen. "She said she was getting older and needed to be closer to her family." Thomas looked at him. "She said that?" "Yes." "Her family is in Dorset." "I know." "Margaret is in Kent." Thomas kept his voice entirely neutral, which is considerably closer to Dorset than Devonshire is. Something moved across Sebastian's face, quick and then gone. "Thomas, I'm not accusing you of anything." Thomas pulled out the chair across the desk and sat down, an unusual thing for him to do without being invited, and they both knew it. "I'm telling you what I think is happening because I don't think anyone else is going to tell you." Sebastian was very still. "The staff is leaving," Thomas said. "Not all at once, not in a way that makes it obvious, but Whitson and now Mrs. Finch. These are not people who leave. These are people who stayed here for 20 years because they believed in what this house was. They're leaving now because what this house is has changed. The estate is profitable. The operations are, Father." Thomas leaned forward slightly. "Lord Hartwell withdrew from the water rights negotiation. Mrs. Finch is going to Kent. Whitson resigned after 19 years. 3 families in the north have fallen behind on rent for the first time in a decade. Clifford is developing processes that should have existed in a different form for years." He paused. "These things are connected." Sebastian stood up. He moved to the window. Thomas had seen him do this so many times now, move to the window when something needed to be not looked at, that he had begun to understand it as a kind of confession. A man who moves to the window when he is standing in a room full of things he has not yet found a way to face. "Your mother created dependencies," Sebastian said. His voice was controlled. "Arrangements that ran outside the formal structure. When those arrangements were removed, she didn't create dependencies," Thomas said quietly. "She created trust. There's a difference." Sebastian turned. His face was not angry. That was what surprised Thomas. He had expected anger, which would at least have been clear. What he saw instead was something closer to the expression of a man standing in a room that used to be familiar and finding that all the furniture has been moved. "She should have done it differently." "Maybe," Thomas said. "Or maybe the reason it had to be done her way is because the other way, the formal way, the documented way, was the way you were willing to approve. And what you were willing to approve wasn't enough." Sebastian stared at his son. Thomas was 14 years old, and he had just said the truest thing that had been said in that study in months, and they both knew it, and neither of them knew what to do with it. "You sound like her," Sebastian said. "Good," Thomas answered. Silence stretched between them, not hostile, not warm, but honest in the way that only silence can be when two people have finally stopped performing for each other. Then the moment broke, because it had to, because Sebastian was not yet the man who could stay in that silence long enough for it to change him. "I'll manage it," Sebastian said. He turned back to the desk. "I've managed everything else." Thomas stood. He straightened his jacket. He looked at his father, at the set of his shoulders, at the careful arrangement of his face, at the man who was brilliant and proud, and genuinely believed that intelligence was sufficient armor against consequences. "Father," Thomas said, "who taught you how to manage—" Sebastian looked up. "Your grandfather. Your grandfather's solicitors. The men at his club who taught you how to keep people." The question landed in the room like something dropped from a height. Sebastian did not answer. Thomas nodded once, as though the silence itself were the response he had expected. He left the study. And in the corridor outside, he leaned against the wall for a moment with his eyes closed, feeling the particular exhaustion of being 15 years younger than the moment he was living in and having no way to make himself older. In March, Celestine Beaumont came to Whitmore. She did not arrive, unannounced. Sebastian had invited her, though he had not mentioned the invitation to Thomas, and Thomas learned of it only when the carriage arrived and he happened to be in the entrance hall. She was exactly as he remembered from the winter ball. Beautiful, composed, carrying her own atmosphere of warmth and ease, the way certain people carry expensive perfume, pervasive without being applied too heavily. She looked at Thomas with genuine warmth. "Lord Thomas, how much you've grown." Thomas inclined his head. "Miss Beaumont." She was shown to the East Guest Suite, the best guest suite, the one that had always been reserved for family or for guests of particular significance. Thomas knew which guest it had last housed and who had made that decision and what it had meant when she made it. He went to write his mother a letter. I was not sure what he was going to say. He sat at his small desk with the paper in front of him and the pen in his hand, and he thought about what his mother would want to know, and then he thought about what she already knew, and then he thought about what she might be feeling in a house in Kent that was not hers, managing a life that was smaller than the one she had built, surrounded by evidence of her own competence, in a place where that competence was no longer being used. He wrote Mama. "Miss Beaumont has arrived at Whitmore. I wanted you to know before you heard it from someone else. I'm well. Thomas." He did not write Father is using the East Guest Suite for her, which is the suite you used for the Hartwells at Christmas, and for your sister when she came in the summer. He did not write Mrs. Finch left last week, and I think she has gone to be near you. He did not write, I am frightened in a way I cannot fully explain, because the house feels hollow in a specific way that has nothing to do with who is in it, and everything to do with who isn't. He sealed the letter and sent it with the afternoon post. Her reply came 4 days later. She had written, My darling Thomas, thank you for telling me. Take care of yourself. Learn everything you can from what you are watching, not to repeat it, but to understand it. I love you. Mama. Thomas read it 3 times. He folded it and put it in the inside pocket of his coat, where he kept the letters she sent him, all of them. Every one she had written since January, in a small bundle tied with the same ribbon she had used to tie the first one. He did not know why he was saving them. He knew why he was saving them. Celestine Beaumont stayed at Whitmore Abbey for 3 weeks. In those 3 weeks, Thomas observed her with the same quiet, total attention he had learned at his mother's knee, and what he observed was more complicated than he had expected. She was not cruel. She was not deliberately unkind. She was in many ways exactly what she appeared to be, a woman who had learned to make herself necessary to people who were lonely, not through malice, but through an instinct as natural to her as breathing. She was warm to the staff. She was charming at table. She asked Thomas questions about his studies with what seemed like genuine interest. But she did not know Whitson had worked at Whitmore for 19 years. She did not know his name when Thomas mentioned it. She did not know about the 4 tenant families in the north who were behind on rent. She did not know about the wool arrangements, or the drought relief, or the water rights negotiation that had collapsed because of an evening she had spent singing French songs at a piano while the room rearranged its judgments about the Duke of Whitmore. She did not know any of it. And Sebastian, Thomas observed, did not tell her. Not because he was hiding it. Thomas did not think that was it exactly, but because Celestine had never asked him a question that required a difficult answer, and he had stopped somewhere along the way, expecting that questions should. One evening, Thomas sat across the dinner table from both of them and listened to Sebastian describe the estate's productivity. the wool output, the tenant retention numbers, the agricultural yields, with the fluency and confidence of a man who has learned to present information in its most favorable arrangement. And Celestine listened with her chin on her hand and her eyes warm and said, "You are extraordinary, Sebastian, truly, everything you have built here." And Sebastian smiled the way Thomas had not seen him smile in months. Thomas set down his fork. He said quietly, and without particular emphasis, "Father, old Barrows's knee has been getting worse in this wet weather. Clifford has him on the standard rotation schedule. I think someone should check on him." The smile dimmed slightly. Sebastian looked at him. "I'll have Clifford look into it." "Clifford doesn't know about Barrow's knee. Mama did." A pause. "I thought you should know." He picked up his fork again. Celestine was looking between them with the expression of a woman who understands that something has just happened. Guilt exactly, not grief. Something older and more particular. The expression of a man encountering again the evidence of a specific absence in the specific place where it was most visible. The woman at the table could tell Sebastian he was extraordinary, but she could not tell him about Barrows's knee. She could not tell him which families needed watching. She could not tell him what Lord Hartwell's wife was writing to her cousin in Sefton. She could give him the feeling of being admired. What she could not give him was the thing that admiration had replaced the experience of being truly known and still trusted and still chosen, not despite difficulty, but through it. Thomas understood this. He was 14 years old, and he understood it sitting at that dinner table in a way his father had not yet managed to understand at 43. The comprehension sat in his chest like a cold stone. He finished his dinner. He excused himself. He went to his room and lay in the dark and thought about his mother in Kent. What she was doing tonight. Whether she was lonely, whether she ever thought about the way this house sounded when it was full of the right people. Then he thought about his father downstairs with a woman who would always tell him what he wanted to hear. And he thought there is a particular kind of loss that doesn't announce itself. It doesn't arrive with drama. It doesn't come with a moment you can point to and say, that was when everything changed. It arrives in small things. In a knee that goes unattended. In a letter addressed to a duchess who is no longer in residence. In a housekeeper who goes to be near a woman who treated her like a person worth knowing. It arrives in the space where trust used to live. And once it has arrived, it is the quietest, most total thing in the world. Celestine Beaumont left Whitmore Abbey on a Tuesday morning in late March, and she did not announce that she was leaving for good. She said she needed to return to London for a commitment she could not postpone. She said it warmly, with the particular grace of a woman who has learned to exit situations before they become uncomfortable. She embraced Sebastian in the entrance hall. She told him the estate was magnificent. She told him he was a remarkable man. She did not say, "I will be back soon." Sebastian did not ask when. Thomas watched from the landing. The same landing where he had stood in December, watching everything begin, and he noticed the things that were not said with the same attention he had always given to the things that were. The carriage pulled away. Sebastian stood in the entrance hall for a moment with his hands clasped behind his back, looking at the door. Then he went to the estate office. Thomas came down the stairs slowly. He passed through the entrance hall. He looked at the door his father had been looking at as though it might tell him something different. It told him nothing different. In the weeks that followed, Celestine's departure, Whitmore Abbey entered a new phase, not crisis, not collapse, but something more insidious than either. A kind of grinding daily attrition that wore at the edges of things without ever producing a single dramatic moment that might have forced a confrontation. The spring planting schedules were mismanaged. Not catastrophically, Clifford was competent within the limits of his understanding, and those limits were considerable, but in the specific ways that only become visible to someone who knows the land and the people working it. The rotation that Margaret had quietly adjusted 3 years ago, based on a conversation with 2 of the older tenant farmers about soil quality in the eastern fields, had not been preserved in any formal document. Clifford restored the old rotation. The yields in those fields would suffer for it, but the suffering would not show until autumn, which was too far away for the connection to feel immediate. Old Barrow's knee gave out entirely in April. He did not report it to Clifford. He reported it to no one because the person he would have reported it to was in Kent, and he did not know the new systems, and he was a man of 63 who had spent 40 years not asking for things he didn't think would be given. A stable boy found him sitting against the fence of the north paddock one morning, unable to stand, and ran for help. It took 3 hours for the situation to reach Sebastian, moving through the new administrative channels that Clifford had established, each handoff adding delay that the old system, Margaret's system, would never have permitted because the old system had no channels. It had relationships, and relationships move faster than paperwork. When Sebastian finally arrived at the north paddock and saw Barrows being helped to a wagon, the old man looked up at him with an expression that Thomas, who had run after his father the moment he heard, would never forget. It was not an expression of blame. That was the thing. Barrows was not an angry man, and he was not a man given to self-pity or dramatic gesture. He looked at Sebastian with an expression of simple, unsurprised resignation, the expression of a man who had adjusted his expectations some months ago and was now watching them be confirmed without particular bitterness. "I'm sorry, Your Grace," Barrows said. "I should have arranged my own affairs better." Sebastian looked at the old man and said nothing for a full 10 seconds. Thomas counted them. "You'll be paid through the end of summer," Sebastian said finally. "And the cottage is yours for as long as you need it." "That's very generous, Your Grace." It was generous. It was also too late, and both of them knew it, and neither of them said it. Sebastian walked back to the house without speaking. Thomas kept pace beside him. Halfway across the yard, Sebastian stopped walking. He stood in the middle of the yard with the spring mud under his boots and the sound of the estate working around him. Horses, men calling to each other, the distant rhythm of agricultural machinery, and he was very still. "Your mother knew about his knee," Sebastian said. It was not a question. "Yes," Thomas said. "She's known for 3 years. She built his schedule around it." Sebastian was quiet. "She built a lot of things around a lot of things I didn't know about." "Yes." Another silence. Longer. "How many—" Sebastian turned to look at him. "How many people on this estate are there like Barrows people she was watching adjusting for accounting for that? I have no record of—" Thomas looked at his father steadily. "I don't know. Only Mama knows." Sebastian turned and kept walking. That evening he wrote to Margaret again. Thomas did not see this letter. He learned about it later from a detail so small it almost disappeared the way his father's face changed over the following days as he waited for a reply that was slow in coming. Margaret's response when it arrived was longer than the first. She sent along with the letter a separate document, a careful, organized summary of the individuals at Whitmore Abbey who required particular attention with notes on each situation. Barrows was in it. 6 others were as well. Each entry was written with the same precise economical clarity as everything she produced. No editorializing, no obvious emotion, just the facts arranged so that a person with intelligence could understand what needed to be done. At the bottom of the document, in her own handwriting, below the formal content, she had written one sentence. "These people gave their best years to Whitmore. They deserve to know that someone is paying attention." Sebastian read the document in the estate office with the door closed. Thomas knew this because Polly, the kitchen maid, who had become in the absence of Mrs. Finch the most reliable source of household intelligence, told him that the Duke had asked not to be disturbed for 2 hours. 2 hours was a long time. Thomas thought about what 2 hours with that document would feel like for a man who was intelligent enough to understand everything it contained, and proud enough to have spent months telling himself none of it was necessary. "I thought it would feel something like standing in a room and having all the lights turned on at once." He thought it would be in its own way the beginning. He was right, but the beginning moved more slowly than he hoped. Because understanding something and acting on it are 2 entirely different skills, and Sebastian Ashcombe had spent 43 years developing only one of them. May came. The tenant arrears situation in the north expanded. 4 families became 6. 6 became 9. Clifford managed it the only way he knew how, with notices, deadlines, and formal correspondence that was technically correct and humanly devastating, because the families receiving it had dealt with Whitmore Abbey for decades through a system of trust and personal relationship that the formal correspondence entirely failed to speak to. Two families quietly began looking for other arrangements. Thomas found out because he had in his mother's absence begun doing something he had not done deliberately, but which had evolved out of sheer necessity. He had started talking to people. Not formally. Not systematically. Just talking to them. The way his mother always had. Stopping in the yard to ask a question. Sitting in the kitchen with Polly and listening to what she heard. Riding out to the North Fields and coming alongside the men working there and asking how things were going and meaning it and waiting for the real answer. How was 15 now? He had turned 15 in February without ceremony because the house was in the middle of the Hartley situation and nobody had thought to make much of it. His mother had sent a letter and a small book she knew he wanted. His father had given him a handshake and a watch. How was 15, and he was conducting without any plan or title or authority the business that his mother had always conducted, the quiet, ongoing work of knowing what was actually happening among the people the estate depended on. He brought what he learned to his father, not all at once, and not as accusations. He had learned from watching Margaret that there was an art to giving someone information they needed but did not want. You had to approach from the side, not head on, and you had to make it easy for them to receive it as data rather than as indictment. One evening in May, he sat with Sebastian in the library. They had resumed this habit, the late evening library sessions, without either of them explicitly deciding to, and he said conversationally, while they were both reading, "The Morden family is looking at a farm in Somerset." Sebastian looked up from his papers. "What?" "Robert Morden. His family has been at the east end of the Whitmore estate for 23 years. He's been making inquiries about a property in Somerset." "Why?" "He got a formal arrears notice last month. 3 years ago his wife was ill, and Mama arranged a payment deferral. When the deferral ended, the new accounting didn't carry forward the adjustment properly. He owes what he was told he owed at the time, but not what he actually owes based on the full history." Thomas paused. "He thinks the estate is trying to collect twice." Sebastian set down his papers completely. "That's not—" He stopped. "Is that accurate?" "It's accurate from where he's standing. Whether the accounting is technically correct depends on which set of records you're using." Thomas looked at his father. "The records in Mama's ledgers show one number. The formal accounts show another." Sebastian rubbed his hand over his face. "It's fixable," Thomas added. "But someone has to go to him directly, in person, not a letter from Clifford." "I'll go." Thomas nodded. He returned to his book. "Thomas." Sebastian's voice was different, quieter and stripped of the careful management it usually carried. Thomas looked up. "How many of these situations are you aware of?" Thomas considered the question honestly. "Enough that I think you should go to Kent." The room was very still. Sebastian looked at his son for a long moment. "She won't come back simply because I ask." "No." Thomas agreed. "She won't." "Then, I didn't say go to ask her to come back." Thomas folded his hands on his book. "I said go to Kent. There's a difference." Sebastian was quiet for long enough that Thomas thought the conversation had ended. Then his father stood up. He moved to the cabinet where he kept the estate correspondence, not the formal filing system Clifford used, but the older cabinet, the one that had always been Sebastian's own. He opened the lower drawer and took out a bundle of letters tied with plain twine. Thomas recognized the handwriting on them. Every letter Margaret had sent since January. Sebastian had kept all of them. "I kept them," Sebastian said without quite looking at Thomas. "All of them." Thomas said nothing. "I don't know what that means," Sebastian added. "I don't know if it means anything." "It might." Thomas kept his voice neutral. "Or it might be the first honest thing you've done about any of this." Sebastian looked at him sharply. Thomas held the look without flinching. After a moment, Sebastian set the letters back in the drawer. He closed it carefully with the deliberate motion of a man handling something he is not sure how to put down. He went to bed without saying anything more. The next morning he rode out personally to the Morden farm. Thomas heard about this from Robert Morden's eldest son, who was 12 years old, and who told Polly, who told Thomas that the Duke had arrived without announcement, had sat in their kitchen for an hour and a half, had reviewed the payment records with Robert Morden directly, and had left with an agreement that corrected the discrepancy and restored a payment schedule that both parties understood. Morden's son told Polly that his father had looked when the Duke left like a man who had expected a storm and gotten sunshine instead. "He came himself," was what Morden had said to his wife that evening, according to the son who had been listening from the other room. He came himself. No letter, no man from the office. Himself. Thomas heard this and felt something loosen slightly in his chest. It was small. It was one family, and there were 8 others in various stages of the same situation, and there were still the departed staff and the Hartwell relationship and the summer yield projections that were going to tell a discouraging story in September. But it was something. And something with his father was how everything had always begun. In June, Celestine Beaumont sent a letter. Thomas did not read this letter. He knew about it because Sebastian told him which was itself unusual and which indicated that something in the letter had shifted the ground under Sebastian's feet enough that he felt the need to speak it aloud to another person. They were at breakfast. Thomas was eating. Sebastian set the letter beside his plate and looked at it for a moment before he spoke. "Celestine is in Paris," Sebastian said. "She's been invited to perform for the summer season. She's written to say goodbye, essentially." Thomas looked up. "Goodbye." "She says she thinks—" Sebastian stopped. He picked up the letter and set it down again. "She says she thinks she may have done me a disservice by making things seem simpler than they are." Thomas was very still. "She said that, in her own way, Celestine doesn't speak directly. She speaks in implications." Sebastian's voice was careful. "But the implication is clear enough." "What else does she say?" Sebastian looked out the window that looked out over the front drive. "She says she admires me, but she's not certain she ever understood me. She says she's not built for the kind of life a man like me actually leads." He paused. "She says she hopes I find what I'm looking for." The breakfast room was quiet. Thomas looked at his father's face and saw something he had not seen in a long time. Not quite vulnerability, which was too soft a word for what Sebastian was capable of feeling, but something adjacent to it. The particular expression of a man encountering the limits of what he had chosen. "She was honest with you," Thomas said. "Yes." Sebastian's voice had gone flat. "More honest than I was with myself." He picked up the letter. He folded it. He put it in his breast pocket. He did not take it out again that Thomas ever saw. July was the month the full weight of the situation finally became undeniable. The summer yields came in early. A warm June had accelerated everything, and the numbers were worse than Clifford had projected. Not because of weather or any single manageable cause, but because of the accumulated effect of a dozen small misalignments that had each seemed manageable, and together had compounded into something that was not. Clifford presented the figures to Sebastian in the estate office. Thomas was there because Sebastian had asked him to be, which was becoming a regular habit. Sebastian consulting his 15-year-old son, the way he had once apparently consulted his wife. Clifford walked through the numbers with the composed delivery of a man who has decided that clarity is the most useful form of kindness. When he finished, the room was quiet. Sebastian looked at the figures for a long time. "The eastern fields," he finally said. "The rotation change. Yes, Your Grace, the soil in the eastern section appears to have needed different management than the standard rotation provides. Was there previous documentation of this?" Clifford's pause was almost imperceptible. "Not in the formal records. But it existed somewhere." Another pause. "I believe Her Grace had informal notes on the topic. They were not included in the documentation she sent in January." Sebastian turned to look at the window. Thomas watched his father's reflection in the glass, the set of his jaw, the stillness that was not peace, but its opposite. The particular stillness of a man holding a large thing very carefully, because he is afraid of what happens if he lets go. "The eastern fields weren't in the documentation she sent," Sebastian said. "No, Your Grace, because I asked for the tenant record specifically. I didn't ask about the land management." He turned back from the window. "She answered exactly what I asked." "It appears so, Your Grace," Thomas said quietly. "She always does." Sebastian looked at him. She answers exactly what you ask. Thomas kept his voice steady and low. She always has. She doesn't volunteer what you haven't asked for, because the last time she tried to give you information you hadn't asked for, you told her she was being sentimental. The room was very quiet. Clifford found something in his documents to look at. Sebastian stood at the center of the estate office with the summer yield figures on the desk in front of him, and the window behind him, and his son across from him, and the accumulated weight of 8 months of decisions pressing down on the room with the specific gravity of things that have been chosen and cannot be unchosen. "What do you want me to do about the eastern fields?" Clifford asked carefully. "Restore the previous rotation." Sebastian's voice was flat. "Whatever it was. Find out what it was. The records. Write to Her Grace. Ask her. Specifically ask her about the eastern field rotation." He looked at Thomas. "I'll write the letter." Thomas nodded. Clifford gathered his documents and left. Sebastian sat down in the estate chair, the chair behind the desk, the chair that was in all symbolic terms the most powerful seat in the administrative life of Whitmore Abbey. He looked like a man who had just discovered that the chair was not as comfortable as he had always assumed. "I'm going to Kent," he said. Thomas said nothing. "I'm not going to ask her to come back." A pause. There are things I should have said months ago. Things I should have said last year." He looked at Thomas directly. "Things I should have said when it still would have meant something different to say them." "It might still mean something. Don't comfort me." His voice was quiet but firm. "That's not what this is. I'm not going because I think it will fix anything. I'm going because it's what's right. Because I treated a person of extraordinary capability and character as though she were a convenience, and she left, and everything that has happened since then is the direct consequence of that choice." He picked up a pen and then set it down. A man should be able to say that to the person it affected, even if the saying comes too late to change the outcome. Thomas looked at his father for a long moment. He saw for the first time in the full and unambiguous way the man his mother had once loved. Not the version that had calcified around its own certainty. Not the version that had stood in a ballroom with another woman on his arm and called it a social courtesy. The original version. The version that had once turned to a young woman from a smaller family and said, "What do you think?" He was in there. He had always been in there. He had just been buried under a very long accumulation of not being questioned. "She'll hear you," Thomas said. "She'll listen. I don't know what she'll decide, but she'll hear you." Sebastian nodded. He began to write. He wrote for a long time, not the letter to Margaret, about the eastern fields. Thomas realized but something else, something longer, something that involved setting the pen down twice and sitting with his hands flat on the desk and then picking it up again. Thomas left him to it. He walked through the house, through the rooms that Margaret had arranged, and the corridors she had walked, and the entrance hall where her absence was most palpable, because it was the place where she had most visibly stood between Whitmore Abbey and everything that wanted to diminish it. He thought about what his father had said. "I treated a person of extraordinary capability and character as though she were a convenience." He thought about Barrows at the fence. He thought about the Morden family's relief when Sebastian had come in person. He thought about Whitson's face when he said she knew things about people, about what they needed before they needed to ask. He thought about the ledgers locked in a cabinet in Kent, containing 14 years of precisely that knowing. He thought about his mother in her family's small estate, managing a school for workers' children, quietly building a smaller version of exactly what she had built at Whitmore, because that was who she was, and who she was had not been given to her by this house, or this marriage, or this title. She had arrived with it. The house had simply been the largest available canvas for it, and now she was in Kent painting on a smaller canvas, and Whitmore Abbey was trying to understand why everything it had taken for granted had turned out to have a source. Thomas stood in the entrance hall. He looked at the space where she had stood on the night of the winter ball in her dark green silk and her inherited emerald clips, descending the staircase with her shoulders back, while the room watched her and her husband stood across the floor with another woman on his arm. I thought she knew that night. She already knew. She had not left in anger. She had left in clarity. And there was an enormous heartbreaking difference between those two things, because anger ends and can be apologized to and can be recovered from. But clarity once achieved is not reversible. You cannot unsee what you have finally allowed yourself to look at directly. Sebastian left for Kent 3 days later. He told Thomas the evening before. They were in the library. The fire was burning and the light was low, and it was the kind of evening that felt in its quietness like a door on the verge of opening. "I'm not certain what to say to her," Sebastian admitted. It was the most unguarded thing he had said in months. "I've been thinking about it for days. I know what I want to say. I don't know if I have the right to say it." Thomas looked at him steadily. "You don't need the right. You just need to be honest. She'll know if I'm not. She always does." Sebastian made a sound that was almost a laugh, not quite, but the nearest thing to it Thomas had heard from him in a long time. "She always has. I used to find it useful." He paused. "I stopped finding it useful when it stopped being convenient." "And now?" Sebastian looked at the fire for a moment. "Now I think it may be the thing I respected most about her, and spent the most energy trying to avoid." He stood. He straightened his jacket. He looked at Thomas with the expression of a man who has run out of defenses and found on the other side of them something that might be integrity. "Look after the estate while I'm gone." Thomas nodded. He watched his father leave the library. He listened to the footsteps going down the corridor and the sound of the study door and the quietness that settled afterward. Then he stood, and he went to the window, and he looked out at the night. Somewhere in Kent, in a house that was smaller than this one, and quieter, and hers in a way, Whitmore had perhaps never fully been his mother, was doing what she always did in the evenings. Reading, writing, thinking, watching. She was not waiting. Margaret Ashcombe had never in her life waited for someone else to give her permission to proceed, but she was. Thomas believed paying attention, the way she always paid attention to everything with that total patient, unsentimental regard that had built this estate from the inside and held it together long after the man who owned it had stopped looking at the seams. His father was going to Kent, and whatever happened there, whatever words were said in whatever room, with whatever silences between them, it would not be simple, and it would not be quick, and it would not resolve the way things resolve in stories, where someone apologizes, and someone forgives, and the world rearranges itself into its proper shape. Thomas knew this. Howe was 15 years old, and he understood with a bone-deep certainty that felt both too heavy and entirely appropriate for his age, that the story his parents were living was not that kind of story. It was the other kind. The kind where people are too fully themselves, too damaged, and too capable, and too proud, and too real for the resolution to be clean. The kind where what gets salvaged is not the original thing, but something harder and more honest built from what remains after the original thing has broken and sorted and been looked at clearly. He turned from the window. He went to his desk. He began to write to his mother, not to tell her his father was coming. Sebastian would arrive before any letter could, but because he needed to write to her. Because she was the person he always wrote to when he needed to think clearly, and he needed very badly to think clearly. He wrote, "Mama, Father is coming to Kent. I don't know what he will say, but I think he has finally started to understand what he lost, not the estate, or the management, or the practical work of it. You. He has started to understand that he lost you. Whatever you decide, I want you to know that I understand the difference, and that I am proud of you for knowing it first." He sealed the letter. He sent it with the morning post, and then he waited in the way that people wait when the most important things are happening somewhere they are not, and all they can do is trust the people in that room to find their way through it. Sebastian arrived in Kent on a Thursday afternoon without announcement. He had written ahead, a single brief letter telling Margaret only that he intended to come, not asking permission, not requesting a time, simply stating it as a fact, and leaving her the space to decide what to do with that fact before he arrived. She had not replied. He came anyway. The Ellison estate in Kent was everything. Whitmore Abbey was not modest in scale, unpretentious in its arrangement. A house that had been built for the people who lived in it, rather than for the impression it made on people who visited. It sat in a fold of the Kent countryside with the matter-of-fact solidity of something that has never needed to prove itself. Sebastian's carriage turned through the gate, and he sat with his hands on his knees and looked at the house, and understood for the first time that Margaret had not come here to hide or to grieve or to retreat from anything. She had come here to be exactly herself, in a place that asked nothing of her except what she chose to give. The housekeeper who answered the door was a small woman with a composed face who told him without apology that her Grace was at the school and would return at 4 o'clock. It was 2:30. Sebastian waited in the front sitting room. He had not sat quietly in a room with nothing to manage for longer than he could remember. He was a man who had always filled stillness with work, with plans, with the ongoing calculations of an estate and a title and a life, conducted at the level of constant motion. He sat in the Ellison sitting room, and he waited, and he did not reach for the correspondence in his coat pocket, and he did not rehearse again the words he had been composing for 3 days. He simply waited. At 4:10, he heard the front door. Margaret came into the sitting room, still wearing her outdoor coat, which meant she had been told immediately upon entering that he was here, and had chosen not to stop to change or compose herself further before facing him, which meant Sebastian understood with the particular precision that he had spent months relearning that she had decided to meet him exactly as she was, without performance, without preparation, without armor. She stopped when she saw him. He stood. They looked at each other across the sitting room of her family's house, and for a moment neither of them said anything, and the silence was not hostile and not warm, but honest in the specific way that only exists between people who know each other completely and have heard each other genuinely. Sebastian. Her voice was neutral, not cold. Neutral, the careful neutrality of a woman who has spent months constructing a life that does not require her to perform an emotion she does not feel. Margaret. He did not move toward her. Thank you for letting me come. I didn't stop you from coming. She removed her coat and handed it to the housekeeper without looking away from him. That's different from an invitation. I know. She moved into the room and sat in the chair by the window. Her chair, he could tell from the way she settled into it without looking the unconscious ownership of a seat that belongs to the person who always uses it. She did not invite him to sit. He sat anyway. The Eastern Fields, she said. It was not a question. Among other things. Clifford restored the old rotation. Not yet. I told him to, but I wanted to speak with you first. There's a specific soil management approach in the eastern section that isn't in any formal record. I need to understand it before any change is made. He paused. I need to understand it from you. Margaret looked at him for a moment. You came to Kent to ask me about soil rotation. I came to Kent because I owe you an honest conversation. The words came out more directly than he had planned, but then he had spent 3 days rehearsing careful versions, and they had all felt like the same thing dressed in different clothes. The Eastern Fields are the reason I gave myself permission to come. The actual reason is that I have spent 8 months watching everything you built hold the weight of what I did to it, and I am not going to pretend that a letter was sufficient for that conversation. Silence. Margaret's hands were folded in her lap. She looked at them for a moment. What did you do to it? She said quietly. Not a challenge. A question precise, asking whether he actually understood what he was confessing to. I made you invisible. He kept his voice even. Not at once, gradually, over years. I took the work you were doing and I called it sentiment when it inconvenienced me, and I called it support when I needed to present it as evidence of my own competence. I made decisions that overrode yours without understanding what your decisions were built on. And when you tried to tell me, I told you that you worried too much. He paused. I was a brilliant man who confused having built something with understanding it. Margaret was very still. You sound like Thomas, she said finally. Thomas is the reason I'm capable of saying any of this. Sebastian's voice was uneven for a moment, just a moment. He has your way of saying true things without flinching from them. It's remarkable. And it has been for the past 8 months extremely uncomfortable to live with. Something moved across Margaret's face. Not quite a smile, but the thing that lives one layer beneath a smile, the warmth that comes before the expression forms. "He wrote to me," she said. "He told me you were coming." "Before you could receive the letter." "Yes, but I knew anyway. Mrs. Finch told me you went to the Morden farm yourself." Sebastian blinked. "Mrs. Finch." "She writes to me every week." A pause. "She went to be near you, Sebastian, in the only way she could." The information landed with a precision that Sebastian had not expected. Mrs. Finch, who had given notice in the language of old age and family proximity, had gone to Kent to be near Margaret. Not to abandon the Duke, but to remain near the Duchess, because that was where her loyalty lived, had always lived, would likely always live. "I didn't know that," Sebastian said. "I know you didn't." Margaret looked at him directly. "There's a great deal you didn't know. There's a great deal you chose not to know. And those are different things, and I think you understand the difference now." "I do." "Tell me." He looked at her. She meant it, not as a test, not as a performance, but as the genuine requirement of a woman who had heard enough polished regret in her life to know the difference between a man who has understood something and a man who has learned to say the right words. "The work you did at Whitmore was not support." He kept his voice steady. "It was the actual structure. The tenant relationships, the informal arrangements, the knowledge of every person on that estate, not their account status, but them who they were, what they needed, what would hold them, and what would break them. That was the foundation. I thought I was building the house. You were laying the ground it stood on." He paused. "I couldn't see it, because you never demanded that I see it. You just kept doing it. I tried to tell you. Once, at the beginning. And I told you it was sentimental." His jaw tightened. "I have thought about that conversation more times in the past year than in all the years since it happened. You came to me with something real, and I dismissed it in one word, because it challenged my idea of how things worked. And you went away and built it anyway quietly, and protected the people who needed protecting, and protected me from the consequences of decisions I was making without enough information." A pause. "You built a shadow structure around my blind spots, not to deceive me, to compensate for me." The room was quiet for a long time. Outside, a bird was doing something in the hedgerow. The afternoon light was changing. Margaret unfolded her hands. She placed them flat on the arms of the chair. "The woman who married you," she said slowly, "loved you very much. She believed in you completely. She believed that if she showed you over time what good leadership actually looked like, not in lectures, not in confrontations, but in practice, in daily example, you would see it, and it would mean something to you." She paused. She spent a long time believing that. Sebastian did not look away from her. "I know. She was wrong. Not about who you could be, but about whether watching someone do a thing right is sufficient to teach a man who has decided he already knows the right way." Her voice was steady and quiet, and entirely without self-pity. "You had to lose it. You had to watch it leave and feel what the leaving cost. There was no other way for you to see it." "No," Sebastian agreed. "There wasn't. That is—" She stopped. Then more carefully, "That is the thing I find hardest to forgive. Not the winter ball. Not Celestine Beaumont. Those were symptoms." She looked at him with the clear, unflinching regard that he had spent years trying to redirect. "The thing I find hardest to forgive is that I told you, and you didn't believe me, and the only evidence you would accept was catastrophe." The word sat between them like a stone dropped in water. Catastrophe. He felt the accuracy of it without flinching from it, which was itself, he realized, something new. 2 years ago, he would have argued with the word. He would have said, "Catastrophe is too strong. The estate is still functional. The situation is manageable." He would have made the evidence smaller to fit the version of himself he preferred. He didn't do that now. "You're right," he said. "That is the thing that deserves the most accounting." Margaret looked at him. "Are you going to ask me to come back?" "No." She was surprised he could see it, the slight adjustment in her expression, the brief recalibration. "No, I spent the journey from Devonshire deciding I would not ask you that. He kept his hands still on his knees. I know what you built in Kent. I know about the school and the families you're supporting, and the life you have assembled here that is yours in a way. Whitmore never quite was. I'm not going to walk into your house and ask you to dismantle that because I've finally understood what I should have understood years ago. He paused. That would be asking you to pay for my education, again. Margaret was quiet for a long moment. She stood. She moved to the window and looked out, and her back was to him, and Sebastian looked at the set of her shoulders, familiar as his own breathing, as intimate as anything in the world, and he did not speak. I miss it, she said finally. Her voice was lower. Not the title, not the scale of it, the formal events, the management of the social calendar. I don't miss those things. A pause. I miss the people. Barrows, the Hartleys, Mrs. Finch's laugh, the way the North Fields look in October when the harvest is just coming in. She turned. Her face was entirely open, which was perhaps the most extraordinary thing Sebastian had seen in this entire extraordinary conversation. Margaret without her careful arrangement. Margaret saying something that cost her something to say. I miss Thomas at breakfast. Sebastian's chest tightened. He misses you at breakfast, he said. Every morning. He sits down and looks at your chair, and then he looks at his plate, and he doesn't say anything. He's been doing it for 7 months. Margaret pressed her lips together. He's all right. He's more than all right. Sebastian stopped. He's the best of both of us. He has my capacity for strategy and your capacity for humanity. It's a combination that is going to make him either a great duke or a very inconvenient one. He paused. I'm not certain there's a difference. And there it was. The almost smile, the full version this time, crossing Margaret's face before she could prevent it. And Sebastian felt something ease in him at the sight of it, the way a man feels something ease when a door that has been stuck for months finally gives. She turned back to the window. What are you proposing? Her voice was careful again, but not cold. Careful in the way of a person thinking precisely, not protecting. I'm not proposing anything. He stood. He moved to stand near her, not beside her, not yet, but near. I'm telling you what I came to say. That I was wrong. That I understand now what I did, and what it cost, and what I failed to value. That I am not going to spend the rest of my life pretending that Whitmore Abbey is functioning adequately when I know what it was when you were in it. He looked at her profile. And I'm telling you that whatever you decide, whether you choose to remain here, whether you return to Whitmore under different terms, whether we find some arrangement that neither of us has thought of yet, I will not ask you to be smaller than you are. Not again. Margaret turned to face him. She looked at him with those eyes that had always seen him more clearly than anyone else. More clearly he now understood than he had ever been comfortable with. The woman who married you, she said quietly, cannot come back. She waited too long for you to notice her, and the waiting changed her. I am not that woman anymore. I know. I am someone who has spent 7 months discovering that she is entirely capable on her own terms. Someone who does not need Whitmore Abbey to have purpose or value or a place in the world. She held his gaze. I need you to understand that before anything else is said. I understand it. Do you? Yes. He said it without defense, without qualification. The Margaret Ashcombe who walked out of Whitmore in December was not a woman leaving because she had nowhere else to go. She was a woman leaving because she finally decided she deserved somewhere better. He paused. I understand that. I am asking you not to return to what was, which I know is not possible, but to consider whether what could be between two people who have both changed might be worth building. The sitting room was very still. Margaret looked at him for a long time, the full, total regard she had always given to things that mattered, that encompassing attention that saw everything and missed nothing. I need time, she said. I know. I'm not saying no. Sebastian heard the words and held them carefully the way you hold something you are afraid to grip too tightly. I'm not saying yes either, she added. I'm saying that what you've said today is it is the most honest conversation we have had in a very long time. Possibly the most honest conversation we have ever had. She moved away from the window back toward the center of the room. And I am not indifferent to it. I want you to know that. That's enough, Sebastian said. More than enough. She nodded once. The eastern fields, she said. Sit down, I'll explain the soil management. And they sat. And she talked, and he listened. Actually listened, with the full, undivided attention he had spent years parceling out on his own terms. And she explained the rotation and the soil conditions, and the 3-year adjustment she had made, and why. And he took notes in the small book he always carried, and he did not once interrupt with a counter-argument. When she finished, he looked at his notes. I'll have Clifford implement this in September, he said, before the autumn planting. The Hartley family, she said. How are they? Stable. The wool arrangement was restored. He paused. It's in the formal records now. Now something softened in her face. Good. 9 families, he said. All 9 informal arrangements are now documented. Clifford. He stopped. Reconsidered. I have a new estate manager. Clifford was capable, but not suited. The new man is older. He spent 20 years in Yorkshire on an estate not unlike Whitmore. He understands the human side of it. Margaret raised an eyebrow. You replaced Clifford. In May, Thomas suggested it. Sebastian allowed a slight expression that was the closest he came at this point in his life to self-deprecating humor. Thomas has been suggesting things for months. Most of them were correct. All of them were things you would have suggested years earlier. He learned from watching, Margaret said. He learned from watching you. The afternoon had gone golden by now. The light in the sitting room shifted to the particular warmth of late July in Kent, and they sat with the notes between them and the season outside the windows and the long history of everything they had been to each other, filling the room without being spoken. I received Thomas's letter, Margaret said. The one he sent the morning you left. Sebastian looked up. He said, She paused. Her voice was composed, but not quite steady. He said he was proud of me for knowing the difference first. Sebastian felt the words land in him, the way Thomas's words always landed precisely and in the exact place where precision was most required. He's right, Sebastian said. You knew. You always knew. I kept telling myself you were being emotional, and the truth is that you were being accurate, and I was the one being emotional. I was protecting my own sense of myself rather than looking at what was real. He closed the notebook. I am sorry, Margaret. Not as a strategy and not as a prelude. Just I am sorry. For all of it. For the long accumulation of all of it. She looked at him, and for a moment, just a moment, he saw it. The woman who had married him, who had believed in him, so completely, that she had built her entire life around trying to help him become what she thought he was capable of being. She was there underneath everything that had changed, underneath the woman who had packed her ledgers and gone to Kent and discovered she didn't need Whitmore to be herself. She was there. She had not disappeared. She had just grown around the wound the way living things do, incorporating it rather than being destroyed by it. I know you are, she said quietly. She did not say it's all right, because it was not precisely all right. Some things do not become all right simply because they are regretted. But she said, I know you are, which was its own kind of grace. They had tea. They talked about Thomas, about his studies, about the ways he had been managing the estate in Sebastian's absence, about the book he had been reading, and the questions he kept asking that neither of them had easy answers for. They talked about the school. Margaret was running 14 children now, from 7 families, all workers' children, who would otherwise have had no formal education past a certain age. She had brought in a young woman from London to teach mathematics and writing, and the woman had stayed, and 2 of the fathers had begun helping to maintain the schoolroom building because they believed in what was happening inside it. You built another one, Sebastian said. He meant it as a simple observation, but it came out with something underneath it, admiration and grief, and a kind of awed recognition. It's smaller, she said. It's exactly the same size as the one you built at Whitmore. He looked at her. You were always going to do this, weren't you? Wherever you were. She considered this. Yes, she said. I think so. Because it's who you are. Because it matters. She set down her teacup. The children matter. The families matter. The fact that I happen to do it well doesn't make it about me." Sebastian was quiet for a moment. "I told Thomas to be the man I could have been," Sebastian said. "When he asked me what I wanted for him, I told him—" He stopped. I didn't know how to finish it. I just said, "Be better." And he looked at me in that way he has, and he said, "Better at what, father?" And I didn't have an answer. Margaret looked at him. "Better at seeing people," she said. "Yes. He already is." "I know." A pause. "He learned it from you." She did not argue with this. She simply let it be true, which was Sebastian was learning the way Margaret received things that were accurate without false modesty, and without performance, just simple acknowledgement of what was real. He stayed for dinner. He had not expected to. He had not presumed to. But Margaret's mother, who appeared at 6 o'clock with the brisk and unsentimental warmth of a woman who had never particularly feared anyone's opinion, informed him that dinner was at 7, and there was no reason to eat alone at an inn when there was a chair available. Sebastian had not met Margaret's mother many times. What he had observed in those meetings was a woman from whom Margaret had inherited the precise, patient intelligence that had always been her most distinctive quality, and who had clearly, over the course of a very long life, developed excellent instincts for which battles were worth fighting, and which were simply theater. Dinner was in some ways the strangest meal Sebastian had ever eaten. He sat at a table in the Ellison house in Kent, across from his wife, and beside her mother, and they talked about agricultural reform and the Education Act, and a novel that Margaret's mother had been reading that she felt had an essentially dishonest view of rural poverty. It was entirely ordinary. It was the most ordinary evening Sebastian had spent in over a year, and in its ordinariness, he began to understand something he had not been able to see before, that he had spent years filling his life with consequence and scale, and the machinery of a great estate, and in doing so had somehow lost access to the thing that made any of it worth the doing. The simple fact of being in a room with people who knew him and were not performing for him. He had not realized how long he had been performing until he stopped. After dinner, Margaret walked with him to his carriage. They stood in the drive of the Ellison estate in the July evening, and the air was warm, and the sky was the particular shade of deep blue that comes just before the first stars appear. "The legal arrangement," Sebastian said. "I've spoken to my solicitor. The terms Margaret suggested, I mean your solicitor's terms, are more than reasonable. I've signed where I needed to sign." She nodded. "The formal separation, the legal structure that would protect her interests and her autonomy, that would give her the Ellison estate in her own right, and a settled income that required nothing of her had been agreed in April through correspondence between solicitors without drama." "I'm keeping the title," she said, "not defensively, as a statement of fact." "It's yours," he said. "It has always been yours." She looked at him. "Sebastian." A pause. "What you said today, it mattered. I want you to know that." "But." "No, but." She shook her head. "Just it mattered. What you've become in these months, what you're becoming, that is the man I believed you were capable of being 20 years ago." She looked at him directly. "I'm glad you found him, even if it took losing everything to do it." Sebastian felt the words settle into him. "I haven't lost everything," he said. She raised an eyebrow, a question. "I haven't lost Thomas." He paused. "And I haven't you left Whitmore, Margaret. You didn't leave being someone I can speak honestly with. That's not nothing." She was quiet for a moment. "No," she agreed. "It isn't nothing." The carriage was waiting. Sebastian looked at her, at this woman he had married at 30 and not fully seen for a decade, and was only now beginning to truly understand at 43, standing in a drive in Kent after the most honest day of his life. "May I write to you?" he asked. "Not about the estate, just may I write?" She considered it. "Yes, yes," she said. "You may write." He nodded. He got into the carriage. He did not look back as it pulled away, because that seemed like the right choice to move forward without pulling at what he had left, without making his need the last thing she saw. But Margaret stood in the drive and watched the carriage go. She watched it until it turned through the gate, and the sound of it disappeared into the Kent evening. Then she stood alone in the drive for a moment, with the first stars coming out above her, and the school dark and quiet across the yard, and her mother's voice somewhere inside the house, talking to the housekeeper about tomorrow's arrangements. She was not sad. She was not triumphant. She was not the woman who had stood at the top of a staircase in December, holding herself together with both hands, while her husband walked into the room with another woman on his arm. She was someone who had gone through that and come out the other side of it, and found that what was on the other side was not devastation, but clarity. And clarity, as she had told Thomas months ago, was not the same thing as indifference. She went inside. She wrote 2 letters that evening. One to Thomas, brief, warm, telling him his father had come, and that they had spoken, and that she was well, that he should not worry that she would see him at Christmas, because she had decided she would come to Whitmore for Christmas, and she had decided it today, sitting across the dinner table from a man who had finally stopped performing and started telling the truth. The second letter she put aside, unfinished. It was the letter she was writing to herself, not literally, but in the way that women of her particular capacity sometimes write, through the act of ordering her thoughts on paper, of giving structure to the experience of the day, so that she could carry it correctly. She wrote, "He came. He said what he should have said. He did not ask for anything in return. This is either the beginning of who he was always capable of being, or it is too late to matter. I do not yet know which, but I find that I do not need to know tonight." She put the pen down. She went to bed, and for the first time in 7 months, she slept without the particular weight that had been sitting on her chest since December. Not because anything was resolved, not because the wound was healed, but because she had been fully seen today by the one person from whom being seen had always mattered most, and even late, even imperfectly, even with all the cost of the lateness fully acknowledged between them, it had mattered. It had mattered. Years passed the way. Years do, when the people living them are genuinely working at the business of being human, slowly in the living, quickly in the remembering. Thomas turned 21 in February of 1893 and was formally presented to the estate at a ceremony at Whitmore Abbey that was attended by nearly every family in Devonshire who had known the Ashcombe name for more than a generation. Margaret came from Kent. She had been coming to Whitmore for Christmas and for Thomas's significant occasions since the July afternoon in the Ellison Drive, and each time the house received her back, not as the Duchess in residence, but as something more complicated and more honest than that, as the woman whose name was still on half the informal arrangements that governed the estate, and whose understanding of every person in it was still 5 years later more precise than anyone else's. Sebastian had changed. Not completely. A man who is formed the way Sebastian was formed does not change completely any more than a river changes its fundamental course. But he had changed in the specific ways that matter. He listened differently. He asked questions he would not previously have asked. He made the journey to the North Fields himself when the harvest was difficult, and he knew now the names of the men who worked them, and the particular needs, and the particular families, and the particular histories that made each of them a person rather than a position in an account book. He had learned. It had cost him everything to learn it, and he had learned it anyway, which was the only version of the story that offered anything worth keeping. At the ceremony for Thomas, they stood together, not husband and wife, because the legal separation had held and would continue to hold, and neither of them pretended otherwise. But together in the way of people who have shared the most consequential years of their lives and come to a version of each other that is built from honesty rather than performance. Thomas stood before the assembled tenants and families of Whitmore and gave a speech that was brief and precise and entirely himself. No borrowed eloquence, no rehearsed sentiment, just the plain and genuine truth of what he intended for the estate and for the people in it. When he finished, the room was quiet for a moment. Then it applauded, not the formal managed applause of social obligation, but the real kind, the kind that comes from people who have been waiting to feel certain about someone and have just been given the reason. Old Barrows was in the back of the room in a chair his knee supported. He had come back to Whitmore 2 years ago not to work, but because Margaret had quietly arranged for him to live out his remaining years in the cottage Sebastian had promised him, and because Whitmore was his place, had always been his place, and belonging to a place is not something that expires when a person is no longer useful to it. He was applauding with the rest of them. Sebastian stood near the back of the room. He was watching his son, watching Thomas receive this moment with the same composed, genuine grace. He had always shown the grace that was Margaret's unmistakably in its character, if not in its specific shape. Margaret came to stand beside him. They stood together and watched their son. "You raised him well," Sebastian said. "We raised him." Her voice was quiet and matter-of-fact. "You gave him the capacity to think at scale. I gave him the capacity to think about people. Thomas put them together himself. We don't get credit for what he made of what he was given." Sebastian almost smiled. "That is," he said, "exactly the kind of thing you have always said that I spent years not understanding, and now find I cannot argue with." "You could try. I'd rather not." He paused. "I've learned which arguments I'm capable of winning with you." She did look at him then, and the look had in it the whole long, complicated history of them, the marriage and the distance, and the winter ball and Kent, and the years of careful, honest letters, and the Christmas visits, and the gradual, painstaking construction of something that had no name, because it was not a reconciliation, and it was not a friendship exactly, and it was not indifference, and it was not the original thing, but was something made from all of those things together, something they had built from the wreckage without pretending the wreckage hadn't happened. "You learned," she said. "Too slowly," he said. "Yes, but you learned." She turned back to watch Thomas. "That matters. It matters that you learned." Thomas caught his mother's eye across the room. He raised his chin slightly, the gesture precise, and contained that meant, "I see you." That meant you are here, and it is enough. That meant in the full depth of what it carried between them, thank you for everything you could not say out loud, and everything you showed me instead. Margaret raised her chin in return. And across the room, the Ashcombe heir smiled, not at the applause, not at the title, not at the estate, or the name, or the accumulated weight of 300 years of stone and history, but at his mother. At the woman who had packed the ledgers instead of the jewelry. At the woman who had known the difference between staying and surrendering, and had had the courage to act on that knowledge at the highest possible cost to herself. At the woman who had never in all the years he had watched her confused dignity with stubbornness or clarity with coldness or strength with the refusal to feel. He smiled at her the way you smile at the person who taught you what to look for in the world, and what to protect when you find it, and what it costs to be the kind of person who keeps their word to the people who depend on them. Sebastian kept his title. He kept his estate. He kept his name, which still meant something in Devonshire and in London, and in the rooms where men of property gathered to discuss the business of a changing century. But the one thing he never reclaimed, the one thing that had walked out through the front door of Whitmore Abbey on a December morning with a leather case full of ledgers and 14 years of irreplaceable knowledge, was the woman who had once stood beside him and believed with her whole capable heart that he was better than he was. He did not deserve to reclaim her. He had learned finally the difference between deserving something and being given it anyway, and he had learned that the second kind is the only kind that comes from love. Real love. The kind that makes a choice every day and does not require the person it is given to be perfect, but does require them to be honest. Margaret had been honest with him from the beginning. It had taken him 20 years to return the favor. But he returned it, and in the end, that was the story of the Duke of Whitmore, not the title he inherited, not the estate he expanded, not the wealth he accumulated, or the name he carried forward into the last decade of the 19th century. The story was simpler and harder than all of that. The story was a man who was given something extraordinary, and did not know it, and lost it, and spent the rest of his life understanding what it had been. And a woman who built the same thing twice in 2 different houses, with 2 different scales, and was equally herself in both of them. And a boy who watched all of it, and learned and carried what he learned into the future, that was waiting for him, which was perhaps the most important thing any parent can leave a child. Not the estate, not the title, not even the name. The knowledge of how to see people clearly, and what to do with what you see.